Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, folks. I am so happy you're all here. We'll give people another second to get started, but it is noon Eastern time, 9 a.m. Pacific on a Thursday, and that means it's time for MTI Live. This is a series where we have interesting and important conversations. First, to share with the MedTech Innovator and BioTools Innovator cohorts, but secondly, to share with our broader online audience on YouTube and LinkedIn Live. And we welcome all of you today. Glad to have you. It's a privilege to be with you. My name is Diane Buis. I am here at MedTech Innovator, where I'm the director of the US program. Welcome to MedTech Innovator Live. Today is MedTech Innovator Live number 6, and it's part of a back-to-back series where yesterday we had BioTools Innovator host a discussion on boards. And so today this discussion on talent is really the flip side. Both of these webinars are the people side of startups. It's a critical component. And we're glad to have these discussions. For those who are joining us online for our internet audience on LinkedIn and YouTube, MedTech Innovator is the largest accelerator of medical devices in the world. We're a downstream accelerator, which means we're not looking for people with ideas, but for people with companies that are up and running, that have teams and prototypes, early evidence that the technology works, and then partner them with experts in the industry, strategics, and others to help them bring their product to market as quickly and as efficiently as possible with as much value as possible. And so MedTech Innovator really is an accelerator for medical devices, healthcare IT, and diagnostics. And BioTools Innovator is an accelerator for R&D tools and personalized medicine. And you can, of course, learn more about both of the programs and the folks that are represented today on our websites. We're opening these webinars up to the broader ecosystem. So if you're on the live stream and you have questions, please submit them. Our team will funnel them to us and we'll try to get to them during the live stream. If we don't, we can engage online with folks later. For the cohort companies, please make use of the Q&A function or the chat. We will get to private Q&A after we bid our online audience goodbye, but you can start teeing up the questions and I'll make sure we get to them later. With that, it is my privilege to give our 3 panelists today an opportunity to introduce themselves. They have both worn many hats and they've done many things. And they're even in different geographies, spanning a real broad swath of what we're talking about when we're talking about global startup growth. I will just call them up by name and give them an opportunity to introduce themselves and their work, and then we'll jump into questions. I'll first call up Matt Gardner. Matt, tell us a little bit about your work and yourself, please.
Thank you, Diane. Really pleased to be with you today. And as I mentioned a little bit ago, I couldn't be more excited to actually join MedTech Innovator for this conversation because I was there when it was born. And so really happy to see how it continues to thrive and grow. And I can't tell you how we never could have imagined this kind of trajectory in those early conversations for Paul's vision and everything that has happened since. So really excited to be here. I've been doing various things in startup world since the 90s and have about 15 or so startups under my belt. I think the first one that really bit me, gave me the bug, was called the Patent and License Exchange. We raised $30 million from SoftBank and others. The founder was a PI at UCLA, and that was about 6 or 8 years before Sarbanes-Oxley, which of course created the 409A requirement, which we had envisioned before Sarbanes-Oxley. So we tried to create a market. It turned out not to be possible, but it was a heck of a lot of fun doing it. And if I could do it over today, I probably think we still would have blown $30 million from SoftBank and had a really good time doing it. So great experience and obviously gave me just tremendous inspiration to try again. So Today, I am the head of the life sciences group at CBRE, and CBRE is the largest real estate firm in the world, and I'm just really ecstatic about being able to take this kind of ecosystem experience into the field through CBRE, and we'll talk about some of our work again later.
Fantastic. Appreciate that introduction. Let me tee it up for Markesia. Markesia Pierce, tell us a little bit more about where you are and your work, your journey to date.
Sure. Thank you so much, Diane, for inviting me to be here. This is just a great opportunity. I think for the context for the audience, it's important to kind of say that I also am a scientist by training. So I did my PhD at Vanderbilt in molecular physiology, and knew around that time that tech commercialization, even though I didn't know the entire word and feeling around it, was where I was headed. And so I did do a postdoc at Michigan State University with a PI who started up an academic spin out, and that kind of solidified for me that this is definitely that intersection between business and science is where I wanted to be. It was a small team of 3, academics spun out around small molecule therapeutics, worked with them while I was getting my MBA at the time, so I could have some skills under my belt to kind of translate that science story. And we worked with that company and that innovation for a few years, and it led to the whole company being acquired by a larger pharmaceutical company. So was able to kind of see the transition from, you have this innovation in the lab, you want to get it out to market. What are the different type of steps along the way, particularly if it's coming out of the university? Everything from government grants to investor presentations to, starting up the company, getting that back end tech stack together. Just really enjoyed it. Since then, I've been working with several accelerators or organizations that help other academic startup companies do exactly the same thing, a little bit later stages as well, when they're starting to communicate with the FDA, be able to bring on board contract research organizations. And those experiences came from being the life science consultant for the Small Business Development Center on the tech team. And currently for this particular audience, the latest engagement was Spartan Innovations out of Michigan State, where we just did our MedTech Accelerator for companies that were specifically working on their government grants. So being able to SBIR, SCTR. So being able to kind of share and go with the journeys with these early stage companies is definitely something I really enjoy. And so I'm happy to share some of those experiences on the call.
Fantastic. And last, certainly not least, Anne-Osdoi, would you tell us a little bit about the many hats that you have worn and that you still currently wear?
Yes, thank you, Diane, and very happy to be here with all of you today. So my name is Anne. I am based in France, in Paris, not in Paris today, about an hour away from Paris, just enjoying a quiet August. August is a very quiet month in France traditionally. I'm a biomedical engineer by background. I was trained both in Europe and in the US, did my master's degree at Johns Hopkins, and then subsequently worked for about 10 years in medtech startups, doing really a lot of, I would say, mostly non-R&D functions, but very diverse things, initial clinical work, initial market access work, first demos, first trade shows, supporting initial customers, launching larger clinical studies, securing reimbursement, basically following the journey and the life of a startup until it was fully commercial, raising money, of course, taking a company public. And after I did that for about 10 years as an operator, I joined an entity called MD Start, which is a medtech company builder, which is very, as you said, Diane, that, medtech innovator does not look for concepts and ideas and, initial, material from which to create startups. Well, that's exactly what MD Start does, right? We look for this, seminal IP and inventors, founders, typically from academia or from the clinical field, who have an idea, who want to remain clinicians in their daily occupation, but would like to see that concept transformed into a product through, of course, a startup experience, right? And so we partner with these inventors and founders. We create medtech companies, and we develop those products. And the unique piece about MD Start is that, of course, we provide the funding, we create these companies, but we also run them, we manage them. And as such, I've been the founding CEO of 4 of our portfolio companies, 2 of which went through the MedTech Innovator Program, and we're actually in the final round of those programs, being Safe Heal a few years ago, and then Moon Surgical just last year. So I'm currently the CEO of Moon Surgical. And over the years, MD Start, became a strategy in a larger fund called Sofinnova Partners. So I am running MD Start and a partner at Sofinnova Partners currently as well.
And thank you for that. I wanted to make sure that our audience understands that you can really, each of you, come at these questions from a lot of different vantage points. And so really appreciate that. I'll come back to Matt where I started. Matt, one of the reasons I figured it would be really interesting to have you on board for this conversation is your company recently released a report. And I put it in the chat for our cohort companies, and we'll make sure we post it on social media as well. It's a tech talent report. And so I would love to hear from you some high-level thoughts on, first, we'll perhaps start with geography. So many of our companies are growing across the US, but we also have a fair number of companies who are international and are looking for that first landing spot in the US. And this is exactly the type of report we're all looking for to compare, where should I be? So what can you tell us about the geography with respect to where is the talent?
Thanks, Diane. I think really the important place to start when you're reading this report is to be aware that what we're attempting to measure and index is where biomedical researchers are across the United States. And so we're really focused on the core talent behind R and especially D. So looking at how that has ebbed and flowed for a couple of decades. And we also take a look at the long-term trends. So let me start with a couple of long-term trends that I think are really interesting. We like to keep in mind that this is an industry that requires a really long cycle. Just because product development is difficult, there are high barriers to entry. And of course, regulators don't let us take too many shortcuts. So you really have to look at what the long wave looks like. And of course, it doesn't match the general economic cycle. And so that's really important to keep in mind. One of the top findings of this report overall is that since the dot-com burst, 2001, the telecom burst, 2001, 2002, there has not really been a negative growth cycle in life sciences employment in the US. So the downturns that we saw in the overall economy in 2002, 2009, and the present one are not accompanied by a reduction in the overall headcount in biomedical research talent in industry. So that's a really interesting challenge. The growth that you can see sort of going into double digits over 2020, 2021, 2022, that was the end of a very long sustained bull run, a tremendous number of IPOs that bull run began 2015, kind of peaked and came to an end late 2021, technically sort of had an overhang into 2022. But I bet if we said to Anne, hey, we'd really like the valuation we were getting in December 2021, she would say, so would everyone. And it's just not there anymore. So I think at the end of the day, what we see now is what feels like a dip is not actually a dip. It's actually a return to normal. And so what we came to experience in 21 and 22 was not the expectation we should have for a new normal. It was an outlier. And so those events led to growth surges that were sort of 20 to 40%, depending on how you slice it. And now we're back down to a more routine growth rate that looks much more like the period of 2005 to 2015. Let me take the camera into a little bit more of a sort of microeconomic view. If you look across the country at where those pockets of excellence are, if you were entering the US looking for your first beachhead and thinking about where you'd want to be, first of all, you should ask your investors, and Anne will probably have views of where you should be thinking about. But the things that you should take into account might include cost of living. So this report does a really interesting job of taking all those things together instead of just looking at what wages are or where the regions that are the deepest in biomedical research talent. You also need to keep in mind, if you're going to hire a dozen researchers, their salary will go a lot further in Boulder or Houston than it might in Boston or San Francisco. And so one of the things that you can see very plainly in this report is how the average salaries in our universe of research talent don't actually change very much. If you're going to hire a microbiologist or a material scientist in anywhere in the US, their salary only changes just a little bit. Their cost of living changes a lot. And so that's a really interesting challenge, and it really paints a picture for us. Now, there are some surprises. We would expect big headquarter cities, Houston, Denver, Chicago, and Atlanta, to always show up on people's radar. There are great things that you can find in, Detroit, Minneapolis, and Orange County in the industry, of course, always having a deep pool of engineers and trained workforce. The ones that are surprising to me are, I think, the ones that we maybe expected less, that you'll see highlighted in the report, including Salt Lake City and Tampa and Pittsburgh. And so I think there are pockets everywhere. I think if you were thinking long-term, though, you'd also want to look at where you've got a reliable output of that long-term workforce, where the medical schools are. That's one of the reasons why I particularly like the Atlanta story. The Texas Medical Center in Houston is a great story. The Chan Zuckerberg move into Chicago, I think, is really significant and is a really interesting signal to watch from the outside as what they're betting on in Chicago comes into play with Northwestern and University of Chicago as well. So I think there are ways to sort of glean emerging markets from the report that may surprise some people beyond just the view of, Orange County, Minneapolis, Boston, and San Francisco.
I very much appreciate that comment, and to some extent the direct shout out in terms of what are we looking at when we're coming from abroad. And you have built companies, that crossed the Atlantic. And so I'm curious to hear, what has your approach been to how do you find US talent when you're on the other side of the ocean? How have you looked? And where have you decided to look, and how have you decided to look?
Yeah, this is obviously a challenge for everyone between seed and Series A, and I'll take a stab at this, but I know my colleagues will have thoughts as well. I've cheated on this by starting with 1099s, and I think it's a great formula to get started, to actually make a team much bigger than you might be able to afford by putting everyone on full-time payroll. So one of my favorite things to explore early on is to look at how you can consider plugging someone in as a contractor for a particular niche early in your company growth cycle. And if you are able to get over those initial prototyping hurdles and lots of those early company challenges, considering when is the right time to pull those people into full-time roles and grow the company. But if you're able to do that, the amount of talent available to you in the freelance universe is exponentially larger and further afield. So you're not necessarily stuck with, hey, and I've done this, I've been employee number one in an incubator in Palo Alto. If I don't have to be stuck with the universe that will commute to Palo Alto, everything becomes open. And so I think that is a great way to build a much bigger team on fractional cost at the beginning.
Super. Let's give the microphone to Anne on that question.
Sure. Yeah, it's a very, very relevant question for us, right? When we build companies, we we look at the US market first. We go to the FDA first. Given the regulatory situation in Europe, we might do our clinical work initially outside of the US, but for sure, we think globally from the get-go, and we try to build a team that is going to be global in essence from the very beginning. And, if we take the example of Moon Surgical, we did have that question. We could put a company anywhere, right? We had a technology transfer that we were executing in Paris. We had a surgeon founder that was in Paris, and then we had to build everything from scratch. And so the way I did it was really over a period of 6 months. I had a few conversations with people who had a lot more knowledge than myself in our specific field, surgical robotics, and asked them, okay, who are, not who are, but, what are the initial functions that you would hire for, this effort? Basically, how would you write those job descriptions? What should these people, be able to do? And initially, you're looking to hire, 1, 2, 3 people, not more, and they need to be able to do a lot of things. So, brainstormed with a few people on what those key attributes were for first hires. And then the second question, Diane, as you said, was, where can we find those people? And again, had a few discussions. Now that I knew which profiles I needed, had a few discussions with probably the same experts, but now asking them, okay, where would you go and find them? And I reached a conclusion, which was, I could build a team in Europe, in France specifically, but it would probably take us, 3 times the time it would take us with a team in the US to get to the same result. It would cost us a lot less, for sure. But we were, well-funded company with of course, an MD Start seed round, and our mandate is really to accelerate. It's really to reach those value inflection milestones in a short amount of time. And to do that, the only solution was to hire experienced people who had done it before. And you have experienced people who have done it in Europe, but the reality is they might not have seen the full life cycle of a surgical robotics company from inception to exit, and even to integration into a larger corporate. And so, the conclusion was, okay, well, we will need to build a team across, the Atlantic. Basically, we will have, some resources based in Paris. We, as I said, had this tech transfer going on. We had our arm supplier based in France and, needed to manage that. I think it's also fair to say that specifically on software positions, they're very hard to find anywhere, but they're very good and less expensive in Europe, So I was like, okay, if it's going to be hard, let's just, go find software people in a place that makes more sense from a cost perspective. And then for people who had a true surgical robotics experience, we're going to find them in the US where they are, and where basically surgical robotics companies are, where they are being developed and sold and integrated. And that meant the Bay Area. As someone based in Paris, it was not necessarily my first choice. We toyed with Austin, we toyed with Boston, we toyed with Minneapolis, but the reality is that people were in the Bay Area. And, some of them have exited out of the Bay Area since then, but the pool of talents is still there. And given that my priority was really to accelerate the company, get a first version of the robot that we could bring into the clinic, that's where we needed to go, period, right? So from that point, now that I knew which type of people I needed and where to find them, it was a lot of networking and identifying, some names came up repeatedly. And then I entered this very intense courtship with a few individuals and spoke with them on a weekly basis for, a few months until they were convinced that this was, a project worth joining. But that's really, how, we approached it. And, it took time, but we really found the right people and I think made the right choice in terms of the location and the profiles.
Really appreciate.
But I would say it really depends on the specific project and, you know, what you're looking for in these initial profiles and the specific technologies at stake and expertise that you need to put together. And I agree with Matt, you know, going with contractors on, you know, specific functions initially goes a very, very long way.
That's very helpful. And I'd like to dive into some of the tactics on how, just like you mentioned, Matt, a 1099 approach or so in a little bit. But I'd like to stay for another moment on the geography. And Marquisia, I know you work with earlier stage companies, and just like Anne just said, it very much depends on the situation, right? And so her example involved a company that had a pretty good funding situation and could afford to seek very experienced talent. That is not everybody's situation, and that is especially in different geographies and in different places. That's different. I know that you are in the Midwest. You're supporting startups locally. I would love to hear your perspective on how people source talent, especially the locally versus going, for example, to the Bay or to Boston. What does that look like from your vantage point?
Sure. I really appreciate this question because the growing conversation around talent in the Midwest is that you do have a large amount of talent coming back and establishing and trying to establish some impact in their respective states. So there are a lot of communities where, or organizations or firms where they were able to experience a large amount of growth. And for whatever reason, usually it's they have family in the Midwest or they have another emotional connection. They come back and try to establish, you know, that second act or even continue what they were doing a little bit closer to a community that's important to them. What you'll see in those situations is that if they're you have these different types of touch points where you see that there's a lot of collaboration with the universities or state organizations. So in Michigan, there's the MEDC that really have put together some programming and initiatives in place to see that talent be expanded upon, be supported. And so if you're in the earlier stages, there's a couple of vantage points that I see people going out into getting that early talent. So if you are looking at establishing a company that is really requiring a little bit more strategic support. So if you're with an accelerator or you're with a region that has really good ties to the local economy, a lot of those different regions will have programs in place where they can bring in some of the talent that's come back. They're either consultant firms or they are entrepreneur in residence, mentor in residence. They've seen the story before and they have gotten on this track of how can I interact with some of the local emerging companies that are coming up. So having an entrepreneur in residence that can kind of help you as almost like a fractional COO or a business development type of arm, somebody who can point you in the right direction in how you can navigate your regional funding mechanisms, statewide funding mechanisms, and being able to kind of help you on that strategic base. I've seen a lot of positive interactions with established organizations that have taken that approach to being able to kind of share that knowledge in a formalized setting. I mentioned earlier, if I was part of an academic startup, and I've seen grow over the last couple of years, this really big push to incorporate those graduate students, those postdocs, those early stage scientists who want to go over to the business side of things and get that experience. They're able to, by project, engage with these entrepreneur residents or these mentors in residence and help on on a particular SBIR type of project, or this local grant project, a small project that you're able to move the needle for, it makes a big deal for the company. So being able to use those types of organizations is really helpful to not only establish your footing in the local ecosystem. As you guys know, a med tech company can't survive just by itself, but tapping into those other talents and support system is huge. And so a lot of the times, those formal and formalized squishy relationships in the network really do lead to job creation and being able to extend that innovation story, because you're able to use those systemized talent connectors, if you will.
I appreciate that. And I might kind of just follow up on this with Anne, just because, you wore the company CEO hat for the last question, but I'd love for you to wear your investor hat for this one. The ways startups often look for, especially for leadership talent, is to go to their investors. And very much we tell startups, when presented with different investors, money does not equal money. What does your investor bring to the table? And one of the aspects of that is talent. And so I would be curious if there are any best practices that you have personally or that you have with Sofinnova as to keeping track of talent and matchmaking talent. That to me is often one of the hardest questions. Where do you find that talent and how do you best matchmake? Are there systems or people that you use to be able to help your portfolio companies source great talent?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and you're right, Diane. I think that is clearly an expectation from you should have from your investors, right? Being able to leverage their network in a very casual and simple manner, even if it's just speaking to other CEOs to identify those recruiters, or to tap into the network directly through introductions. The way we do it as Sofinnova is really dependent on the company, but we do a lot of formal executive search, right? We have 2 or 3 recruiters we go to for that, and happy to share names offline or in the second half of this session if you want to. They are very specialized. I would say the one very important thing is we take time, right? We don't rush. We spend time with people. We fly them over. We get them to meet the team. We get them to meet the rest of the investors or the board. We have a lot of discussions. We travel together. I mean, it's kind of silly things, but seeing how people are going to behave when you board a plane, or when you take them to dinner, or when you take them in front of one of your clinical investigators is extremely important. So we try to spend as much time as possible and not rush into those decisions, which are tricky decisions. Recruitment is hard, right? You don't get it right all the time. You have to be prepared for that. Even if you do the best diligence in the world, it's a question of fit more than a question of hard skills, right? So you get it wrong, occasionally, hopefully not too frequently, but that's part of life. And in terms of the specific tips, we have one thing that I like, which is we have an external organization that is very useful to do independent reference calls, independent from the executive search people we use. And I've found that to be pretty helpful because executive search firms have a vested interest, of course, in you liking the candidates that they put forward. And reference calls are a very biased exercise by nature, right? And so using basically this independent resource to do the reference calls has been helpful also in some instances. But I would say, it's mostly about, thinking about your needs, making sure that the human fit is right by spending time and trying to run a structured process and, involving all the different stakeholders.
I appreciate that. Matt, can I pitch that one over to you? What are some best practices that that especially small companies, one of our companies submitted that question earlier. If I'm 3 to 5 people, I may not have the funding yet to engage a recruiter. Are there, and you've been in this field for a long time and have worn many hats. Are there best practices that are on your mind? And I might go to Marquisia next on that one. What are some best practices to find great talent?
Yeah, I think it's really important to be patient and think long here. And part of the reason why I say that is picking a bad marriage is really painful and can be much more expensive than it's worth to rush into something. So I think a few things are really worth thinking about. One is, if you're in an accelerator program, use the mentor network. It is a great way to make sure you're tapping experts and thinking about everything from not only the specific experts, but then what are the personality types of the people that you want to attract? So it will give you great experience, great exposure to lots of different experts over, in high volume over a stretch of time, and is a good way to explore those things. Then I think, and mention something that I think is really important. The airplane test is real. If you cannot tolerate 5 hours on a plane with the CEO, it's not going to work. So if you're sending your CEO to do a speaking appearance in San Francisco, put someone on the plane next to him just to go through that test if you're going through a recruit process for somebody senior. The other thing I think works about the tap dance process that's worth thinking about doing slower is one of the things that contractor approach gives you is a test window to make sure the fit is good. So if you're going to do a fractional CFO or a fractional general counsel, you really can make sure that you're proving out that the fit is worth the long-term view. And if the long-term view is that you're going to build a company to last, or you're going to build something all the way through to an exit in 10 or 15 years, and you're thinking through that process, that really is going to make a huge difference. And it's much worse if you have rough turnover early on and you have to fix it.
Anything to add, Marquisia?
I really like that approach because if you're a really small team, you're wearing a whole bunch of hats, you really have to be able to cultivate this this culture that is already by nature very risky, very emotional, very resource strapped. You have to be able to know your own capabilities as a leader and what you bring to that table, and know what is needed that's complementary. I know a lot in the tech, in the tech space or med tech space, you think about the technical skills versus the people skills versus the visionary sales type skills. All of that becomes extremely important when you have a small team and everybody's kind of wearing different hats, and you're more likely to be put in a situation where you want to be able to contribute. This is probably something that you might love to be the thought process of doing, but you might not can do. So being able to be in a safe space where you can bring the information that your strengths, your capabilities, your weaknesses to a place where you can really get the information from the entire team of where are the holes, where are the gaps that we need somebody to fill, is very important for making the best next decision that you can. So I think just a practice of self-evaluation. A lot of people do this with the personality test, the leadership test, the complementary team test, the dysfunctions of a team type of framework. It's just vital, because you're able to accelerate your growth a lot better when you have a clearer picture of what your team can bring, what you can bring, and be a little bit more specific and clear on what you need. This data just helps.
I think that's a great point, Markeisha. At Moon, we have like a 6 or 7 step recruitment process, which of course we only implemented when we were, 10 or 15 people, but it includes some sessions. We have a cultural interview, we have like a hard skill interview. One of the sessions that I like the best is a project presentation session. So we ask every candidate that goes up to that step in the process to share with our team, to essentially present a project that they've done in their life. It can be a personal project, it can be a professional project, and that they've enjoyed or where they've learned something. And we asked them to give, a 30 or 45-minute presentation to the team, basically conveying that project and summarizing it in layman's term, and this includes R&D candidates, and being able to share with whoever on the team can attend, what they've built, how they've managed it, what they've learned from it, and why it's important, and why they wanted to speak to us about it. And it's a simple exercise, but it's incredible how much it tells you about people, about their ability to interact cross-functionally, about their ability to summarize things, to address an audience, to adapt themselves to an audience, to communicate. And it's an incredibly powerful thing. When I get to speak with every candidate that gets to the final stage where we basically draft an offer to someone, but I love to sneak into that presentation and listen in for like 15-20 minutes, because it tells you so much about every single candidate. Yeah,
that is fantastic. Let me push a little bit on tactics. One of the things, especially when you're trying to hire standout candidates, that comes up pretty much automatically is salary and stock options. And that's when conversations get squirrely. One of the BioTools innovator companies submitted a question ahead of time, and said, companies or people share their salaries, and then that kind of with each other, which kind of pushes folks to say, gee, I'm not earning enough, I should be making more. How do you keep the peace in a team? How do you determine how to compensate people? And I recognize how thorny of a question it is. And so I'm combining it with a stock option question, just because depending on the type of company we're talking about, stock options are really valuable or not that valuable yet. I'm happy to kind of open that up to all of you. It's a thorny one. Matt, can I point to you to take it first?
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Diane.
Anytime.
I do think there is a little secret sauce here, and Anne probably participates and sees some of these things. A bunch of the big VCs participate in big salary surveys with a couple of boutique recruit firms. So it's a great way to make sure you're keeping tabs, but they tend to focus on the management team. And I would say you get just as good or better data for filling out your team from something like Indeed. I'll just point out, this gets a lot harder in areas where there's constantly high demand. So just in terms of employee sausage making, the areas of highest demand are always in the United States: data science, cybersecurity, and biomedical research. So they vary in, you can see software development come and go, but they tend to break up software development. So if you look at Indeed and look at areas of highest demand, there are about 5 fields of software development. So it's a little bit like cheating. And then data science and cybersecurity are always up there. So in those fields, you'll be pressured, or you'll feel the pressure to be more attractive. Here's one thing we've seen firms do in some of these industry segments where there is that kind of ferocity of competition. Hire someone less qualified and make the person you want. Invest in the person. And so I've seen really smart people teams hire people that are maybe short of a cert or short of the graduate degree, and then build the person. And if you are able to play along like that, hire someone that you're going to put in an apprenticeship program for 2 years and make the person and the skills that you want to make. That is a great way to make sure you're investing alongside someone who sees a vision with you that they'd like to be a part of and to make long-term loyalty with an employee. So I do see really smart teams doing this, especially in those areas of high demand where it's much more difficult to find someone. You can invest in the person that you want to create, and like I say, foster loyalty.
This to me brings up and we can come back to salaries and stock options at a later point. I recognize how thorny they are, but what it brings up to me is mentoring, especially if you're growing your talent. So it's that dichotomy, and I really welcome your opinion on it, Matt. You've made a case for hire less experienced and grow. But that also means a lot of hands-on time from your management team. If you can afford it, you hire someone that has done it all. What should the expectation? And I'll pitch it to Marquisia first. What should the expectation be on mentorship, and what does that look like, especially in a small team?
I appreciate this question because when you think about the development of a person, obviously the person would love to be paid. That salary part and the stock option part is crucial, but I would say just as crucial is where the implication that person feels around how is this going to build me up as a professional, particularly in projects that are high risk, that fail all the time. You want to be able to walk away with that experience, knowing that it's built you up as a professional. Even if the floor caves in, you're able to take away from that experience something valuable and to kind of push your career along. And being able to sense at the very beginning that your leader is somebody who could, I think at the very minimum, could be a good mentor who is able to kind of develop and support and encourage your investment or your advancement on that particular project is just the bare minimum. You want to have somebody who you believe and you can trust in to kind of connect you to or support your opportunity for taking risks and engaging in some of these projects. I think that's the minimum, but having somebody on the team that also can serve as your sponsor, where, if this was to go off, or if you had to move on, you could set yourself up for success, somebody who could help reduce that barrier for you and speak on your behalf, because they not only can see the progress that you're making in very high risk, very risky project or program, but they're still able to advance your career in circles that they are a part of. That's crucial. And you would also, I say that because I had a couple of situations and some of my colleagues where they took a riskier, maybe a lower paying salary position because they felt that even though the monetary gain is a little bit smaller or lesser, I feel like on this team I would be supported. This experience would be able to set me up in the longer term. And I know with companies, you want to keep people on for, you want to build and grow years and years and years, but talent is very much aware that this is high risky. Something could happen, laid off, buyout, acquisition, anything. And that platform that could set you up is really important.
I could not agree more. I think growing your talent has a lot to do with really internally making time and resources available to grow that person. And I think to some extent that is at least I'm going to say a premonition of the answer to how do companies compete with big companies, with big corporates, right? The types of talent that we're hiring or that you are hiring also likely have offers from big corporates. So how does one make a case for job security, mentorship, all of those things, to have someone join a startup over a corporate job that is a safer bet? Anne, is that something that you'd like to respond to? How do you convince people that this is the right fit?
Yeah, I think that's part of the personality you look for in the early days of a startup, right? I mean, if you have someone in front of you who considers and who seriously debates, whether they should be joining a large corporate versus a startup, it's probably not the right person you have in front of you. I think you want to have initially people who would consider a large corporate job as safe but boring. And who would, just thrilled and be excited about working in a startup. And of course, the terms and the conditions have to be right, and it has to be somewhat comparable or in the same ballpark. Otherwise, people start having questions and family considerations, which make total sense. But I think fundamentally, it's about culture, right? You want people who thrive in an environment where resources and money are going to be, scarce in a way, and who deal well with, that challenge, and who basically find a lot of positive energy into it, right? If you're speaking with people who are going to be, stressed by that situation, and who value, safety of the job and comfort more than what you have to offer, then it's fine. It's just not the right fit. And I think it's probably not something you can easily change in someone, right? So you have to screen for it, you have to recognize it, you have to have transparent discussions about it. We have, for instance, on top of the startup thing, we need people in the US to work very early in the morning and people in Europe to work very late at night, because we need some sort of overlap, right? I mean, some people, would love to join us, but they just cannot manage that because they have, constraints or reasons why it's not possible for them. That's totally fine. But you have to be, very upfront with those topics and address them in the recruitment process. Otherwise, you might have someone absolutely great in front of you, but it's not the right fit.
That's very helpful. And fit is where I wanted to go next in the first place. And that is, when we talk about fit, there's a real risk of echo chambers. When we tap into the networks we have, the networks we know. And I think we talk in the startup world as much as everywhere else in society about how inclusive is your organization? Do I see myself reflected in this organization? How do we attract the best and diverse talent to our organizations? And very often, especially in early startups, you have, the co-founders who met each other in school, and then they hire their 3 best buddies. And so they come from a very homogeneous background. And that can represent a problem that can lead to real blind spots. And so how do we cultivate a diverse talent? How do we reach out to people we don't know? How do we find sources of talent and people to build a diverse culture? And diversity along, geography, diversity along education, diversity about ethnic background. I would love to hear your input on how do we find people outside the echo chambers. And I'm happy to have either of you chime in. I'd be curious as to all 3 of your comments on it. I'm going to just watch who goes off mute first. Otherwise, I'll call on people. Matt, I've called on you before. I am, and you've come through for me.
Yeah, I think look, most of us have chosen a field that's about science to begin with, and most of us are early adopters. If you're not willing to be experimental with this too, then I challenge you on this. I think if you're building a team and you haven't experimented, you're never going to find untapped resources. So I've got an example for you. If you've got software development in mind, try a bulletin board like Upwork for a project. I've done this before. I've actually built a team that never had an employee and was all contract resources all over the world. You can do accounting in Costa Rica right now. You can do, back office functions all over Central and South America. There are ways to find teams that you maybe didn't know were out there. And so I've got one now that is using a software team in Central America, and we love them. They're creative. They've shown us things we didn't know were possible because the team isn't software, developers. And so it will help you push your own boundaries to dabble and be an early adopter for innovative models of finding technical teams as well. So I would really encourage people to think about just staying open. I think if you only followed the path to Boston, Minneapolis, Orange County, in the Bay Area, look, you probably will find reliable pools of talent. And so there's a reason they're tried and true, because they work. But if you're looking for places where there's maybe untapped resource or new ideas, you really have to stretch yourself. And I think a great way to do that is to get outside of those pockets, look for contractors that you can try short-term projects with, and use the mentor networks that you've got for referrals to those kinds of resources. I do think I've met a bunch of companies that went through multiple accelerators, and where they may have temporarily relocated to different markets to try some of these things. We had one from Richmond drop into San Francisco. I think the only bad experience about that was he was paying $5,500 a month for rent in San Francisco for a little while, which is painful for a Richmond, Virginia startup. And that was a health tech, a software play. So you can do that in a way that you're trying to tap local markets for talent and early in that development curve. And I just would encourage you to think and challenge yourself. Are you willing to try innovative models to identifying talent, just the same way you're hoping people will be early adopters for a novel product?
That's excellent. Marquisia, can I call on you? I know that is something that you tap into as well, the diverse talent pools.
Yeah, absolutely. There are, it's kind of along those lines, being able to be open to other types of opportunities. We would usually see, you'd go to like a trade show or something where you could find information and other people kind of in transitions. Try going to a trade show or a regional event that is specifically focused on, either a particular tech group or a local, a regional group. For example, I have a couple examples of this. Here in the Midwest, there was a team that bought a tech organization from Miami and brought it up to the Midwest. It's called Black Tech Week. And the whole point of being able to bring like a conference up there is in the very first couple of years is to be able to get those different connections and different interactions with the states in the Midwest. So being able to look at just take a step back. It included not just med tech, not just software development, but just a region or a group in general that were interested in tech. You have a lot more broader thought pools, experiences. It's regional, so you're able to kind of cross state lines. I think the MEDC had brought over 20 different companies just to experience, what was going on across the state border and tap into their talent network and their ideas and things like that. Being able to, if you're in the med tech space, just jump over to a creative type environment. Another, go to a film festival, go to, something that's completely outside of what you're looking at. And you'd be surprised when you start striking up quality conversations, oh, we're doing these things in communications. This is how we've been thinking about telling stories, and this is how we've been trying to get into more of the technical space. Maybe you can bring some of those ideas back to your marketing department or your communications department, or you see how the creatives kind of build teamwork on something that's a lot more expressive, maybe technically. Maybe you could bring some of those frameworks back to your team or a consultant, or to kind of, that's not necessarily in the tech space that you were thinking about, but has a whole different perspective on how to bring people together or try new things or communicate new stories that you hadn't even thought about before. Just being able to go to the places that you haven't is the key, obviously, to getting out of those echo chambers. And then I think the last thing is to be, outside of being intentional about it and engaging in maybe exploratory, uncomfortable types of conversations, building something where it happens regularly. So and a system could be just, I do make it a point to go to another type of organizational meetup that is outside of what my tech domain is, regularly. And, journal, keep that in, ask your team for feedback, be able to kind of start conversations around that, and then make it in incorporation into how you enrich your team. And I think having that space will translate to conversations where you are talking to somebody from a different region, ethnic group, tech industry. They can see that you're at least talking a little bit of their language and help facilitate that collaboration spirit in the company.
I appreciate that. Basically, get out of your own comfort zone. And I find that a very fitting into the public portion of this webinar. Time has flown, and I really appreciate all three of you lending your perspectives. I'd like to continue the conversation offline with the cohort, but would like to give you to give all three of you an opportunity for last words to give our online audience in terms of talent hacks and opportunities or advice in general you have for this challenging but really important talent market. I will start with Anne and then go to Matt. Markesia, if you have anything to add, I'll give you the microphone last. Anne, famous last words.
Yeah, I wanted to share something, and maybe I hope not start a controversy, but I had this notion that when you build a team, you want to have, of course, diversity in background, diversity in culture, diversity in everything. But as I mentioned, when I was building the team, the initial team at Moon Surgical, we were heavily focused on experience in surgical robotics, right? And, this probably only comes from a handful of companies, maybe 2 or 3 very successful companies. And I was worried about reproducing someone else's culture, and I was telling my team, hey, don't go systematically hire here or there. Like we want to have some mix here of people, et cetera, et cetera. And the reality is most of the candidates we were getting, whether through the network or spontaneous, were coming from these companies, and I was getting worried about that. And at that time, I, attended the MedTech Innovator meeting we had in June of 2021, I think, in the Bay Area, and was in a session. It was a roundtable discussion, which was led by Leo Petrosian. It left a huge impact on me. He said a few things, and one specifically on HR, which I thought was really interesting. He said, of course, you're tempted in your initial hires to create, this mix of people, etc. But when you think about it, the risk level that you have between working with someone and have worked with in the past successfully, and who is plug and play in your organization. And then the risk level of, sourcing someone completely new and foreign to your existing team and, hoping that the graft is going to be successful, if you will, is vastly different. It's orders of magnitude. And you have to recognize that in the early days, sometimes you just simply cannot take that risk. And, you might have some concern or frustration about your pool of talents coming from your direct network and always from the same companies, and the expertise being very concentrated. But maybe that's fine, because there are times in your company where you just, have to manage that risk and keep it, very low. And, I came out of that session thinking, okay, well, maybe it's fine. Maybe it's okay. I mean, of course, ideally, we want people coming from different backgrounds, and we will work on that and try to, encourage it. But if we also have great talents coming from, a known entity and people we've worked with in the past, it is going to be a much lower burden on our team to integrate them. And that's also totally fine. So I think there is some opportunistic, way of approaching it. But I think, theories in HR are, they don't work systematically. I would stay very open in the way to approach it.
Matt, any famous last words? Thank you, Anne.
Yeah, I think when you're building an early stage company, pre-product, pre-revenue, it's one of the most important things to me is that you identify people who are resourceful and accustomed to uncertainty and ambiguity. Because really the personality type that you need is somebody who's prepared to do 40,000 tasks 5 times rather than 5 tasks 40,000 times. You know what I'm saying? In other words, in a big mature organization, you can afford specialists. In a growing organization, you really can't. And so I think someone who's shown you various ways that how you've dealt with failure, how you've bounced back, that you understand how to bootstrap projects and are resourceful. I think what Anne's talking about is really especially true for the management team, but for project teams, you can be a little more experimental as long as you sort of have done the Myers-Briggs on those personality types. And that really, really matters for, proof of concept stage when things are going to go south and you will at times have to pivot, and it's necessary that people pivot with you and not hold on to, well, we tried this before. It doesn't matter. Something fails, you move. And you really have to have people that are acclimated to rapidly changing environments. And I think that really comes down to, it really doesn't matter, where you found them, what their degree says. It's about skills more than degrees. And so I think that's what I would come back to every time when you're building those teams, especially project teams. Skills are far more important than degrees.
Thank you for that. And Marquisia, last tips, tricks, and hacks on the talent front.
For the community and the connection, excuse me. I wouldn't underestimate going deeper into some of those connection points that are student educational type things, where they're maybe a little bit non-conventional, and they're trying new things, but being able to just tap that network just a little bit deeper, where you are going above and beyond just a couple of contacts just because they're around funding, but people are really passionate about economic development and regional development and their themes and things like that. You'd be surprised that there are a lot of untapped pockets of opportunity as well. To find diversity of thought and diversity of skill set, those connections are kind of in the fringes, and just encourage people to explore those.
Fantastic. Thank you, all 3 of you. Please stay on while we bid our online audience goodbye. Really appreciate your thoughts, sometimes diverging, And that's exactly why we have these conversations on talent. I hope our online audience comes back next week. We have 2 senior leaders from the FDA to talk about regulatory questions. So looking forward to seeing you then. And with that,